and welcome back. Haven't made a video for a month or so, in fact since the Andor show, because sometimes paying work just gets in the way of our hobbies. So anyway, this is my 15th or 16th video regarding Paul Howard's fluting jig. Now before I get started, I've had a lot of correspondence from some of the many viewers on the Paul Howard Fluting Jig playlist. Now most of these comments are asking me to take things a bit slower and explain in a little bit more detail exactly what I'm doing, and to reduce the amount of fast forward segments of the video and to add a bit more detailed explanation. So in recognition of that request, I'm going to not go exactly back to basics, because there's the previous videos which talk about the basic methodologies I use, but I will take things a bit more slower and explain in some detail what exactly I'm doing. In project number 13 I made this Iroko bowl that has 4 flutes on the reverse and 60 flutes on the top of the bowl, and this is actually one of my most favourite pieces that I've ever turned. I had 2 pieces of Iroko. I managed to get as offcuts from a sawmill, and for this particular project I'm going to use the other piece because I was very impressed with the way that the piece came out and how easy Iroko is to turn. So for this particular project I hit upon the idea of using the fluting jig, obviously to make some flutes, but to fill those flutes with milliput. I'm a great fan of Jim Overton and his channel Jim's and Stuff, and the way that he uses milliput. I've used it before with great success. So I have hit upon the idea of cutting the flutes in the top of the bowl as I've done before, but to fill them with milliput, with in fact black and white milliput, to make something look a bit like an abstract keyboard or something like that.
Okay then, so the first thing to do is to get the piece mounted on a faceplate and get it trued up. Here I'm using a 35mm Forstner bit to make a recess for my logo. Now, since there is going to be no fluting on the base of this project, I can finish it in my traditional way using Yorkshire grit Microfine and Hampshire Sheen high gloss. Okay, so that's the base finished, apart from a final buffing. So I can now dismount the piece, removing the faceplate and reverse it into the O'Donnell jaws. And not forgetting, of course, to mount the index plate before I fit the chuck. Okay, having measured the radius of the inner boundary at 103 millimeters, it's now time to get across to our spreadsheet and do some calculations. Okay then, so we have a 12.7 millimeter cutter, and the smallest radius is in fact 103 millimeter. Now, because this is supposed to represent a keyboard, it needs to be quite chunky. So actually, and we also need to be around about 30 flutes to get a representation of a keyboard. So I think 30 is possible, which gives a gap size of about just under 9 millimeters, which I think will probably do us quite nicely. Now, as far as the milliput filling in the flutes in the top is concerned, I've come up with this pattern or arrangement, which I think gives a good representation of a keyboard. Okay, setting up the router jig then, the first thing to do is to put the lock arm onto the index plate. This has got to be set up quite accurately so that the index plate and the chuck does not move during router operations. Now, to give a larger and a firm base to move the router on, I've improvised a table manufactured from an old bathroom panel. Now, this table is secured to the lathe bed using a recessed nut and bolt through the lathe bed itself. Now, this improvised table needs to be kept smooth, and therefore it's necessary just to run over it with a surform or the like periodically to remove any bumps left by screws. Now, with this particular router jig, you can use a guide bush to guide the cutter along the contour of a piece, but in this case, since it's flat, I can just screw a batten in the right place to ensure consistent depth of cut. Okay, having done all of my safety checks, we can now get on and do some routing. Now, I chose this particular cutter, which is a 12.7mm square cutter, so it gives a square edge when viewed from the side of the bowl, which looks more like a keyboard. Here I am now transferring the pattern for the keyboard from the paper to the piece. Now, milliput is in fact a binary epoxy resin, which means you've got to mix the two components together. Now, I've just had a quick look at Jim Overton's excellent YouTube channel, Jimson Stuff, to find out how he mixes the two components together. Now, Jim advocates constantly folding over the two components together, which actually worked very well for me too. Now, the only thing that kind of perplexes me with milliput is that no matter what colour you choose, one of the components is white, and therefore it dilutes the density of the colour in the final product. Why in fact they don't put the colour in both components is a bit of a mystery to me, at least. Okay, so that's the milliput filling completed, hopefully without any cracks or voids. So just have to leave it overnight now to cure until tomorrow. Okay, overnight the milliput has hardened extremely well, and I've mounted the piece back on the lathe. Now, everybody's telling me to use a carbide cutter on milliput, so I'm going to use a 1-inch scraper. Despite the fact that the scraper is freshly sharpened, it's not making much of an impression on the milliput. Maybe I should try something else. So here I'm having a go with one of my carbide cutters made by Glen Teagle. Okay, so that's that settled in. Carbide tools work very well on milliput. So there it is then, the finished piece, Ebony and Ivory, finished with Yorkshire grit Microfine, Hampshire Sheen high gloss and Hampshire Sheen microcrystalline wax. So the last job to do then is to glue in place my little Lathe logo in the base of the piece. Okay, so there we have it. Ebony and Ivory, a very simple project involving the fluting jig and some milliput to get me back into the swing of things after a month's absence from my workshop. As usual, a couple of flaws.
There's some scratches here in the black milliput, which I failed to remove. I can go back and do that at a later stage if necessary. Also, I forgot to put sanding sealer on the top, and I went straight from sanding to Yorkshire grit. Whilst in most cases that's okay, what's happened here because of the white milliput is that some of the white dust has got embedded into the grain. So thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you again next week.